What's up guys, my name is Jake and welcome to Abandoned, episode 72. Detroit, Michigan is known for having many iconic abandoned buildings. Having explored many of them, they provided me with some of the most surreal experiences of my life. But one absolutely massive cluster of buildings have always stood out for decades as the quintessential abandoned buildings of Detroit. A symbol of the fall of the once great Motor City. They stand even today as a spectacular showcase of modern ruin, spanning several city blocks and in an almost unthinkable condition. But now, after a century of standing as a place of industry and manufacturing of the luxury Packard automobiles, the city may finally be demolishing this long derelict plant. So let's take a look back on where all of this began and journey through the tumultuous decades that ultimately led to this becoming one of the largest abandoned buildings in America. This is the Detroit Packard Automotive Plant. This episode has been brought to you by CuriosityStream. Get access to my streaming service Nebula when you sign up for CuriosityStream using the link in the description below. It all began with the Packard Automotive Corporation. The company produced luxury and very expensive automobiles for the ultra-wealthy through the early 1900s. Established in 1899, the two founding brothers of the company, along with their investors, had decided to move from Ohio to Detroit for their new headquarters and primary base of manufacturing. In 1903, the company purchased large parcels of land and enlisted the help of local architects to construct bespoke factory buildings. They indeed did so with the construction of 9 factory buildings by 1905. Further buildings were constructed soon after. However, this time, they really innovated in their design. See, factory buildings of the era were typically made of high concentrations of wood, which not only meant they were susceptible to fire and erosion, but also meant they could only support so much weight. They were also typically only 2 to 3 floors high, and had small windows which meant minimal natural light. So in the next few buildings of the Packard plant, new construction techniques and concrete reinforcement were utilized. These were actually pioneered by their lead engineer, and these new innovations in concrete would allow pillars and other structural beams to take higher loads. So this allowed the 10th building on the plant to feature this revolutionary design in manufacturing space, allowing wide open square footage, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a decreased risk of fire. It was the first plant in the world to be designed this way, and was a huge leap in worker conditions. The plant saw growth of hundreds of thousands more in square footage, becoming the largest manufacturing plant in America by 1910. They of course helped with the war effort in both world wars, and at its peak, the plant encompassed over 4 million square feet and employed over 40,000 people. For reference, that's larger than the Pentagon. The entire facility spanned several city blocks, around 110 acres in total. Remember those first 9 buildings? Well, by the 1940s, the facility had been divided into around 50 buildings. By the end of the Second World War, the airplane manufacturing lines had been switched back to automobiles and once again began producing vehicles. In order to cut costs, which prior to the war had been slowly building to new highs, the lines had been switched to a system that was supposed to be cheaper but wasn't really designed efficiently for the existing building. Believe it or not, space constraints really began to plague this new design, and temporary metal roofs were erected in between the buildings to accommodate these new assembly lines. Despite Packard still outselling Cadillac, the brand was beginning to suffer monetarily. With the introduction of new vehicles, they saw the decline of their luxury status to something more in line with Buick, who just had a larger market share. With the start of the Korean War, supply chains were restricted and other brands like Ford and Chrysler were outpricing Packard and offering more features like air conditioning and automatic transmissions. In order to stay competitive, Packard needed to invest in R&D to also bring these features to their own products. That was costly, and really the only way of staying alive seemed to have been to consolidate. In 1954, Packard announced they would be merging with the also struggling Studebaker. With the acquisition, they announced they would be moving large sections of their assembly lines to Utica, New York. But even with a major restructuring of the company well underway, the writing was on the wall. The Studebaker Packard Corporation began winding down operations at their massive Detroit plant. By 1956, with sales low and too much inventory across the country, they announced the Detroit facility would close entirely by the end of that year. As you can imagine, with the many people employed, the closure had many severe and lasting impacts on the east side of Detroit, and became one of the largest layoffs in the city. This would be one of the first catastrophic blows to the megacity's economy. As for Packard, well, they didn't last much longer after the closure. Studebaker turned out to be a poor merger and dragged Packard down with them. The last vehicle rolled off their production line in 1958, and the company was soon out of business. 1958 was also the same year the last caretaker for the Detroit plant was laid off. A new company purchased the property and utilized it by leasing out the massive amounts of commercial space. They called it the Motor City Industrial Park, and this venture to fill space was actually rather successful, as nearly half of that massive square footage was leased out, most notably to a department store on the ground floors and several other manufacturing companies. By 1960, around 40 companies had taken up business at the former plant. This continued on until around the late 80s, when the management company sold the land to a new owner called BioResource. I think they bit off a little more than they could chew, since the conditions on the site were getting ugly. Despite almost 90 companies leasing space, the majority were small businesses and not generating much rental income, and not utilizing, or more importantly, maintaining the enormous square footage. To make matters worse, they were also allegedly dumping hazardous waste around the property, which would later cause environmental cleanup issues. Maintaining literally millions of square footage through harsh winters and securing the nearly 2 miles worth of perimeter walls from an increasingly rough neighborhood, well, I'd imagine it's a costly effort. It makes sense as to why the company failed to pay property tax in 1993 and declared bankruptcy in 1997. The city then foreclosed on the property, but did so without telling the official mortgage holder, who had just passed away in 1998. This allowed someone to buy out that mortgage, particularly a man named Dominic Christini, who did just that. Still though, the city had taken possession of the site from the non-payment in taxes. Dominic became the new general manager of the Motor City Industrial Park and sought to keep it open. Yet the city was still seeking full control, mainly in the interest to tear down the property and use what they considered at least to be valuable land. A lengthy legal battle then ensued, all while just a few tenants continued to operate out of the buildings. Other than those companies, the space largely remained in a limbo, abandoned state. Documented by Michael Kuentz in 1999, the former plant clearly had been well traveled by this point, with light yet prevalent graffiti lining the walls and windows broken out. Police had already broken up a car chop shop, and on some occasions, large raves would take place in the empty, wide-open spaces. Clearly, the building was unsecure and now falling into a rapid decay. So the city took matters into their own hands and elected to remove Dominic as the manager of the plant. What follows is genuine chaos. So after Dominic refused to leave the building formally, the city dispatched cops to the scene to forcefully evict him. With the reporter in the room, Dominic barricaded himself in his office, flipped over a conference table, hid behind it, literally stocked with guns, saying, quote, "These cops want to take me out. If they come busting in here, I'm taking some of them out with me." So obviously the police didn't move in on him right away and instead chose to try and handle it peacefully. This standoff lasted 8 months. For some reason, Dominic was never really charged for his protest. Once he finally relinquished after those 8 months, he sued the city. But still, in 1999, they finally got their way, as around 500,000 square feet of property straddling the railroad was demolished. But just as more was set to come down, a court put a stop to the demolition, as the city was essentially illegally demolishing property. Dominic, who was still living inside the former plant, along with some other local businessmen, gathered the money together and actually paid off the property tax debt, which really made things difficult now for the city. Once again, making matters worse, the courts found that the city improperly seized the plant and the ownership would go back to Dominic. Unfortunately for him, however, the legal troubles would continue as his lawsuits just dragged on. He took residence in a nearby abandoned school and began selling drugs. In 2004, he was arrested for distributing ecstasy. Dominic was found guilty and sent to prison. Around the same time, the city police department removed their 24-hour presence around the plant. Now entirely unsecured, the building was thrusted into a massive and quick decay, both from natural circumstances and scrappers who stripped away all they could. Pictures from around this time from photographer Nailhead showcased a seemingly never-ending structure in serious disarray. They document the property over the next few years, and their website is a great archive and journal of what it was like to explore the structures in the early days of online urbex. Their website will be linked down below, as will the other photographers I have mentioned in this video. While this was mostly industrial space, meaning it was large, wide open, and pretty cleared out, there were lots of nods to the past. You can clearly make out that this was a car manufacturing plant. Already though, a common theme moving forward was beginning to happen: the collapse of roofs. In 2010, Dominic was released from prison, now still in possession of a very ugly property he once cared for. But the plant was, however, gaining popularity in its own right, becoming known as an incredible sight to see and a monument of failure. Banksy notably painted a mural inside the Packard plant, and the building served as a set for movies. But now, with all tenants gone and Dominic in a poor financial situation, the city once again had now successfully seized the property in 2013 after he failed to pay property taxes. A cash-strapped city ultimately chose to auction off the land for the price of just $400,000 to a man named Fernando Palazuelo.
Have the strategy very clear, the tactic on the buildings very clear, and finally the logistic. It's poor history, it's poor emotion.
His plans were ambitious, to say the least. At the estimated cost of $500 million, he wanted to turn the complex into a mixed-use residential and commercial park. Now, I've said many times before, I'm no structural engineer, but the shocking condition of the buildings at this point seemed, at least on the surface, damaged beyond repair. The sheer cost of renovations would just be the start, as the surrounding areas weren't exactly in the greatest condition either. The buildings had become infamously known across the city, and the sheer number of access points around it made it almost impossible to keep people out. Bodies then began to be discovered inside the structures, both from apparent murder and accidental falls. Fires became somewhat a regular occurrence, and firefighters were instructed not to enter the buildings as it was deemed to be too unsafe. There was certainly a dark side to this property, and I think everyone wanted it gone. So any development will have to be careful and thoughtful to how they actually achieve this master plan, but also actually get it done. So Fernando and his team pressed on, putting up signs and seeking out investors. The Grand Boulevard Bridge had a tarp covering the harsh reality, and the reassurance from Fernando seemed relentless. In 2019, that bridge actually collapsed from heavy snowfall, and around the same time, the progress made with investors and partners seemed to have fallen apart, though some question if they had any at all. In 2020, Fernando gave up. He laid off the security guards and put the property up for sale. Fernando ultimately never sold the buildings, and instead racked up blight and other fees while also repeatedly breaking promises with the city. So, in early April 2022, a judge ordered the immediate demolition of the property. Fernando made enemies with the city, and upon this demolition ruling, he was instructed to file permits by the 21st, or the city would move in themselves and send him the bill. Either way, he'd be responsible for an estimated $10 million in demolition costs. Really, to no surprise, he failed to file the demolition permits, and the city declared they would begin the demolition process themselves. Which brings us to present day. It's very reasonable to be skeptical on whether or not this will actually happen. Demolition takes money, and it doesn't really seem like Fernando is likely to pay, and might even pursue legal action, which once again could put a wrench in this whole effort to take it down. While it does sit here though, it stands as a pretty astounding icon of decay. Not only does it represent the most spectacular industrial ruin in America, but it's likely one of, if not the largest abandoned building in the world. Not only that, but the conditions of these buildings in the middle of a large American city, especially one that was known for auto manufacturing, creates some very grim and astonishing visuals. With its apocalyptic street view to the crumbling roofs with literally full-grown trees sprouting out of it, it's truly a sight to behold, and I'm glad I made the trip out there to film some of it for this video. If everything does go through though, this footage will likely be some of the last ever to be taken before it's completely gone. Although we'll have to see. In some ways, it's a sad fate for the structure. In others, I just don't see any way it could have been saved. But even if it could, I think the business case for it would have been a hard one to make. That's exemplified by the many, many plans and concepts for the site, which of course had been proposed but never built. While it is in many ways historic and represents a lot from the mega automakers of Detroit's past, the current day reality of the site is nothing more than a nuisance, genuine danger, and for nearby residents, dragging down property value. It simply has to go. And now the only question remains, will it happen soon? Or will it take another decade to actually finish this story? If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content from independent creators like myself, then Nebula is the perfect place. Nebula is a streaming service that I have helped create that was designed to be a platform where creators like me can go and create content that sometimes doesn't always work on YouTube. Aside from seeing my videos a day before their YouTube release and ad-free, plenty of other creators have made exclusive content and Nebula originals. Partnered with Nebula is CuriosityStream, a streaming service focused on curating high-quality non-fiction titles and documentaries across all types of topics. Recently, I've been watching a feature documentary on Charles and Ray Ames, the incredible and prolific designers of some of the most iconic furniture ever made. It's a fascinating odyssey into their lives, and it's exclusively available on CuriosityStream. So if you sign up using my link, curiositystream.com/BSF, you'll get 26% off an annual plan. That's just $14.79 for the year to gain access to 2 amazing streaming platforms. Anyway guys, my name is Jake, and thank you very much for watching.